It was my 24th birthday. Candlelight flickered across crystal glasses. Expensive wine moved slowly from hand to hand, and somewhere between the laughter and the music, a quiet execution of my honor was being prepared. My sister Savannah stood up with a champagne glass in her hand, smiling as if she were about to give a toast. But her eyes were sharp, almost eager.
"This family is ashamed of you,"
She said calmly.
"You keep using the Miller name to fool people with that fake military story of yours."
The room froze. My mother nodded with tight lips, as if my existence itself embarrassed her. My father looked at Savannah with pride, then turned toward me with cold disappointment.
"Take that jacket off,"
He said.
"Apologize to your sister before the police arrive for impersonating a soldier."
I said nothing. The burned scar on my shoulder pulsed beneath the fabric. They wanted me to kneel. What they didn't know was that the only person in the room who had the authority to judge me had just set her fork down. The first thing people notice when you return home after disappearing for 3 years is not what you say, it's what you don't. When I stepped out of the taxi in front of my parents' house that afternoon, I carried only one bag and the same old army jacket I had been wearing for years. The fabric had faded from dust, heat, and too many nights spent sleeping in places that barely deserved the name shelter. Texas sunlight felt strangely soft compared to the desert glare I had grown used to. For a moment, standing on the driveway, I allowed myself to breathe. This was supposed to be home. But home has a way of changing when you're gone long enough. The house itself looked exactly the same. Nothing about it suggested the quiet storms that had been building here while I was halfway across the world. The front door opened before I could knock.
"Well," she said lightly, crossing her arms. "Look who finally decided to come back from her mysterious adventures. You look like you've been living out of a truck."
I came home, I replied. Something like that.
"You look thin."
I've been busy.
"With what?"
I hesitated. Not because I didn't have an answer, because the truth would sound impossible to them. I've been serving overseas, I said.
"Oh, please," she said, walking past me toward the kitchen. "You've been telling that story for 3 years. Our brave little soldier here has been pretending she joined the army."
I felt the air in the room tighten. I didn't pretend, I said quietly.
"I checked. Military records are surprisingly easy to search if you know where to look. No deployment records, no public service file, no service confirmation under the name Maya Miller. You're saying she never actually enlisted? Either that, or the Army decided to hide one of its soldiers so well that not a single database in the country can confirm she exists. Which one sounds more likely to you? Maya, have you been lying to us?"
The question hung in the air longer than I expected. 3 years of desert nights. 3 years of blood, sand, and endless medical shifts in field tents where the sound of helicopters never truly stopped. And now, in the middle of my parents' living room, none of it existed. "I served," I said.
"You disappeared," she replied, "and now you've come back with some heroic fantasy to explain where the family money went. The money Mom and Dad kept sending you while you were away. We supported you. We believed you were struggling somewhere, trying to figure out your life. And now you're telling us you were secretly some kind of soldier? You know what this looks like to everyone else? It looks like she ran away, spent 3 years doing nothing, and now she's come back pretending to be a war hero."
The room went silent. I could feel the familiar ache beneath my shoulder blade, the place where the old burn scar sometimes flared when the weather changed. Savannah wasn't finished yet. Tonight was my birthday, and she had clearly been saving something for the celebration. By the time evening arrived, the house had transformed into something closer to a small private banquet hall than a family home. Crystal glasses lined the dining table, silver candles reflected against polished plates, and the low hum of quiet conversations filled the room as guests moved comfortably through the space. Most of them were people my parents respected. Local politicians, business owners, a few lawyers Savannah worked with, and several family friends who had known us since childhood. To them, it was simply a birthday celebration. To Savannah, it was something else entirely. She had been unusually attentive all evening, greeting guests with the confidence of someone who believed she was hosting an event that would soon belong to her. Every time someone asked about me, She answered with a polite smile that carried a hint of amusement.
My sister just came back after a long adventure.
She would say carefully. The pause before the last word was always deliberate. I stayed quiet at the end of the table, listening to the soft clink of glasses and the occasional laughter from people who had already decided what kind of person I must be. Dinner had nearly finished when Savannah stood up. At first, the movement looked ordinary, the way someone rises to offer a toast during a celebration. She lifted her champagne glass with elegant ease, and the room gradually quieted as guests turned their attention toward her.
I'd like to say a few words.
She began. My mother smiled proudly. Savannah had always been good with words. That was part of the reason she had become such a successful attorney so quickly.
Tonight is a special night.
She continued.
Not just because it's my sister's birthday, but because it gives us all an opportunity to celebrate honesty.
A few people chuckled politely, assuming the comment was simply part of the speech. Savannah reached down beside her chair and lifted a thin folder. The sound of the paper sliding across the table seemed louder than it should have been.
Unfortunately,
She said calmly.
some people in this room deserve the truth more than they deserve a celebration.
She opened the folder and removed several printed documents.
I decided to do a little research.
She said.
After all, if someone claims they've been serving in the United States Army for 3 years, that information should be easy enough to verify.
The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Savannah held one of the pages up just enough for the people closest to her to see.
No deployment record, no active duty listing, no confirmed service history under the name Maya Miller.
She lowered the paper slowly.
In other words,
She continued.
my sister has been lying to everyone in this room.
The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. My father's hand came down on the table with a sharp crack.
You've been using our family name to tell people you're a soldier?
He demanded. It's not a lie, I said. Savannah laughed softly.
Then explain the records.
She replied.
Explain why the Army doesn't seem to know you exist.
My mother covered her mouth, her voice trembling.
Savannah, are you sure?
Savannah slid the folder across the table.
I checked 3 databases.
She said.
If Maya had actually served anywhere official, her name would appear in at least one of them.
My father's face darkened.
You've embarrassed this family enough.
He said. The guests were no longer pretending not to watch. Every pair of eyes in the room had turned toward me. Savannah took a small sip of champagne before continuing.
You see, what makes this especially disturbing is that people respect the uniform. Real soldiers sacrifice their lives for it.
She set the glass down.
And pretending to wear that uniform is a crime.
My mother's voice broke slightly.
Maya, tell us this isn't true.
I looked around the table. The expressions I saw were not anger alone. They were something worse. Disappointment. Not because they believed Savannah completely, but because the possibility that she might be right had already begun to feel convincing. My service isn't public, I said quietly. Savannah smiled.
That's convenient.
My father stood up slowly.
You will explain yourself right now.
He said. But the explanation they expected was one I could never give, because the truth about my deployment had never been meant to appear in any database they could search, and Savannah knew exactly how to use that silence against me. For several seconds after Savannah finished speaking, the dining room remained frozen in silence. The candlelight still flickered across the crystal glasses, but the warm atmosphere that had filled the room earlier had vanished completely. What remained instead was the quiet tension of people witnessing something deeply uncomfortable, yet too dramatic to look away from. Savannah set the folder down in front of her and leaned slightly against the back of her chair, studying me with the calm confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided.
Well?
She asked softly.
Is there anything you'd like to explain to everyone here?
My father didn't wait for an answer.
You've embarrassed this family enough.
He said sharply, pushing his chair back from the table.
I will not allow our name to be dragged through the mud because of some fantasy you invented.
My mother's voice trembled as she spoke.
We trusted you.
She said quietly.
We believed you were doing something meaningful with your life.
I could feel dozens of eyes on me. Friends of the family, colleagues of Savannah's, people who had arrived expecting nothing more than a birthday dinner and now found themselves watching the slow dismantling of someone's reputation. Savannah picked up her glass again, turning it slowly between her fingers.
You know what the real problem is?
She continued.
It's not just that you lied, it's that you lied about something sacred.
Her gaze moved deliberately to the worn military jacket resting on my shoulders.
That uniform represents real sacrifice.
She said.
Real soldiers bleed for it. You don't get to wear it just because it makes you look important.
The room remained silent. Savannah's voice softened, though the words carried even more weight.
So here's what you're going to do.
She said calmly.
You're going to take that jacket off right now in front of everyone and admit you lied.
My father nodded immediately.
That's right.
He added.
Return the uniform before you dishonor it any further.
My mother wiped her eyes with a napkin.
This humiliation can still end tonight.
She said.
Just tell the truth.
The request hung in the air like a verdict. Savannah folded her arms.
Well?
She said again. I didn't move. Not because I didn't hear them, because my body had already begun to react in a way none of them understood. The scar beneath my right shoulder blade had started to burn. It was an old injury, the kind that never fully disappears, even after the skin heals. The doctors had warned me about it years ago, explaining that certain movements or sudden tension could wake the nerves around the damaged tissue. Savannah noticed the stiffness in my posture.
Oh, please.
She said dismissively.
Don't tell me you're going to invent some heroic war injury now, too.
A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the room. My father stepped closer to the table.
If you refuse to remove that jacket,
He said coldly.
then you are no longer welcome in this house.
My mother nodded slowly.
Tonight was supposed to be your birthday gift.
She said.
Your last chance to make things right.
Savannah's voice cut through the room again.
You shouldn't even be using the Miller name.
She said.
People like you shouldn't be allowed to hide behind respectable families.
Her words were sharp. But the most painful part of the moment wasn't what she said. It was the silence from everyone else. No one defended me. No one questioned the accusations. To them, the story had already been decided. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. For a moment, the entire table watched as if expecting some dramatic outburst or desperate explanation. Instead, I simply looked around the room. At the people who had once known me as a child. At the parents who had decided I was a stranger. At the sister who had built this entire evening like a courtroom designed for one purpose: public humiliation. Savannah tilted her head slightly.
So?
She said.
Are you finally going to admit it?
I reached for the edge of the table and steadied myself for a moment. Then I spoke. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Savannah's smile widened.
Yes,
She replied.
I think I am.
That was when I noticed the small movement at the far end of the table. My grandmother had been silent the entire evening. She had listened to every accusation, every insult, every demand that I remove the jacket I had worn through more nights than anyone in that room could imagine. Now she slowly lifted her fork and tapped it gently against the side of her porcelain cup. The sound was soft, but it cut through the room like a command. Every conversation stopped instantly. Savannah turned toward her with mild annoyance.
Grandma,
She began.
we're in the middle of...
My grandmother didn't raise her voice. She only looked at her and said 2 words.
Sit down.
The word itself was quiet, but it landed in the room with the weight of something far heavier than Savannah expected.
Sit down.
My grandmother did not raise her voice, yet every conversation in the dining room died instantly. Even the faint clinking of glasses stopped as if the entire house had suddenly decided to listen. Savannah blinked in surprise. For a moment, the confident attorney who had controlled the room only seconds earlier looked almost uncertain.
Grandma,
She said carefully, forcing a polite smile.
this doesn't concern...
My grandmother lifted her hand slightly. Savannah stopped speaking. No one in the Miller family interrupted her when she made that gesture. It had always been that way. Long before the wealth, the influence, or the large house, she had been the quiet center of the family. And when she spoke, people listened. She placed her fork down on the table with slow precision and looked around the room, her eyes moving calmly from my parents to the guests, and finally settling on Savannah.
You have said quite enough.
She said. Savannah's smile faded.
With respect.
She replied, trying to maintain control of the moment.
The entire family deserves to know the truth.
My grandmother nodded once.
Yes,
She said.
they do.
The answer seemed to confuse Savannah more than challenge her. My grandmother leaned slightly toward the side table beside her chair and reached for a small metal box that had been resting there unnoticed the entire evening. It was old, the kind of heavy iron container people used decades ago to store important documents before safes became common. She placed the box carefully in front of her. The metal latch clicked open with a small, deliberate sound. Inside were letters, dozens of them. The envelopes were worn and creased, each one bearing my handwriting. Savannah frowned.
What is that supposed to prove?
She asked. My grandmother ignored the question. She lifted one of the letters and unfolded it slowly before turning it so the nearest guest could see the photograph clipped inside. The image was grainy, taken somewhere far from Texas. In the photo, I was kneeling beside a wounded soldier, my hands pressing bandages against his chest, while dust and smoke filled the air around us. The room grew very still.
These
My grandmother said quietly.
are the letters Maya sent me while she was overseas.
Savannah opened her mouth to respond, but my grandmother had already reached for her phone. She pressed a button and placed the device on the table between us. The call connected almost immediately. A man's voice answered.
General's office.
My grandmother spoke calmly.
This is Margaret Miller.
There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then the tone of the voice changed instantly.
Yes, ma'am.
She turned the phone so everyone could hear.
I believe my family is having trouble understanding where my granddaughter has been for the past 3 years.
She said. Another voice joined the call. Older, stronger.
Mrs. Miller,
The man said.
I was planning to contact you tomorrow.
Savannah's expression tightened.
And who exactly is this?
She demanded. The voice on the phone responded before my grandmother could answer.
This is General Robert Hayes, United States Army Command.
The words seemed to remove the air from the room. The general continued speaking calmly.
I'm calling to personally thank you for the sacrifice your granddaughter made during her deployment. Corporal Maya Miller served as a combat medic with distinction and recently received the Silver Star for actions taken while treating wounded soldiers under active fire.
My mother's hand slipped from her glass. Savannah's face lost all color. The general's voice remained steady.
Her request was that the recognition remain confidential for the safety of her family.
The phone fell silent. For the first time that night, no one in the room had anything left to say. For a long moment after the general's voice disappeared from the phone, the dining room remained completely silent. The candles continued to flicker across the table, but the celebration that had filled the house only minutes earlier was gone. What remained instead was the uncomfortable stillness of people realizing that everything they believed a few moments ago had been wrong. Savannah was the first person to break. The champagne glass slipped from her hand and shattered across the marble floor, the sound echoing sharply through the room. Her face had lost all color, and the confident posture she had carried all evening collapsed into something fragile and uncertain. My mother looked from Savannah to me, her eyes wide with disbelief.
You were telling the truth.
She whispered. My father didn't speak at first. He stared at the photographs still lying on the table, the ones my grandmother had taken from the metal box. Images of dust, helicopters, wounded soldiers, and a battlefield none of them had ever imagined I had walked through. Slowly, he pushed his chair back. Then he did something I never expected. He knelt. My mother followed him a moment later, her hands trembling as she reached toward me.
Maya, please.
She said, her voice breaking.
We didn't understand. We thought Savannah was protecting the family.
Savannah herself had not moved. She remained standing beside the table, staring at the broken glass on the floor, as if the pieces might somehow explain what had just happened.
I'm sorry.
She said finally. Though the words sounded smaller than the damage she had caused, I looked at them quietly, not with anger, not even with triumph, just with a clarity that had taken years to learn. You're wrong about one thing, I said calmly. My father lifted his head. You weren't ashamed because I used the Miller name, I continued. The room seemed to lean closer. You should be ashamed because you allowed pride and arrogance to blind you to the truth standing right in front of you. No one spoke. You didn't lose trust in me, I said. You chose not to see me. Savannah's shoulders trembled slightly. My grandmother stood slowly beside her chair. The room parted instinctively as she walked toward me, her presence carrying the same quiet authority that had silenced everyone earlier.
Come, child.
She said gently. I nodded. As we walked toward the door, no one tried to stop us. Behind us, the birthday celebration had collapsed into regret and broken silence. At the doorway, I paused for a moment and looked back at the people who had once called themselves my family. Family doesn't turn on its own when the truth becomes inconvenient, I said quietly. Then I stepped outside with my grandmother into the cool Texas night, leaving the house and the noise of their pride behind us. Some lessons arrived too late, and some soldiers learn that their real family is not defined by blood, but by who stands beside them when the world refuses to believe their story. Have you ever been judged or rejected by the very people who should have believed in you the most? Sometimes the people closest to us see only what they expect to see, while the truth waits quietly for the moment it can no longer be ignored. If Maya's story reminded you that honor and truth eventually speak louder than accusations, consider subscribing and sharing this story with someone who might need to hear it. Because out there, beyond the noise of pride and judgment, there are countless silent heroes whose stories still deserve to be told. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who refuses to stay silent for the truth to finally be heard.